We're going to talk a little bit about the cultural presence of foods in the Chicagoland area. And there's going to be a few videos that you could view as well from the URLs in this presentation, but also they'll be listed under the resources for Chicago. Immigrants from all over the world have traveled to the Chicagoland area and settled here. We're known as the City of Immigrants, and they bring their cultures and food with them. The Chicagoland area was first occupied by Native Americans. Some of the tribe names may sound familiar to you, as cities in the Chicagoland area are named for them now. Some of the early inhabitants were the Algonquin people, Potawatomi, Fox, Illinois, and the Native Americans were living here, and then began a large French presence, and Indian Algonquin allies took control of the area. How the city was named Chicago is pretty interesting. It's the French version of the word for stinky onion, or Chicaque. You can view a short video on this on the URL here. It's also in the resources link. In addition to the onion growing along the shores of the Chicago River, we also have a big presence of the Three Sisters, where the Native Americans would grow corn, squash, and beans in our area. The first non-Native Americans to be in the area were the French explorers and missionaries, fur traders. They came in the late 17th century. Americans founded the city of Chicago in 1833, and it grew rapidly due to its location on the shores of the Great Lakes, and it became a major transportation hub. As technology grew, so did the city of Chicago. It was a transportation hub first used by ships, but then as technology developed trains, then it became more of a hub for transportation, because there would be lumberjacks from Wisconsin shipping lumber and millwork down through Illinois, through Chicago. And then Illinois provided the wheat and corn that was going to be shipped all over the United States at the time. So with the construction of the railway in 1850, it became a major transportation for wheat, corn from Illinois, and also the lumber from Wisconsin. And then in the 1870s, refrigerated cars became available through technology, and then fresh meats could be shipped to the eastern cities. In addition to the railroads becoming operable through the Chicago hub, also we had the development of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, the IMC, which allowed shipping from the Great Lakes through Chicago to the Mississippi River and Gulf. And so things that were shipped in or out through Chicagoland on railroad cars could also be put on these boats as well and shipped down south. With the development of refrigerated railroad cars, there came an opportunity to make more money in Chicago, becoming a slaughterhouse. And the Union Stockyards started operating in 1865. It operated for 106 years, and it was known as the hog butcher of the world. But they not only butchered hogs, they also butchered cows and steer for their steaks as well, goats and lambs. It was the major meat packing location in the United States at that time, and they would be able to ship that meat back east or all the way through different areas around the Midwest. So it was the largest meat packing and shipping area and transportation hub at the time. I'd like you to view the video about the stockyards on the link here. It's also in the resources area, but hundreds of thousands of hogs and cattle were shipped to Chicago to be slaughtered, and they were preserved in salt and transported to markets across the U.S. The Union Stockyard Gate is imaged here, and you could still see that in today's Chicago as it has been designated a landmark. The Union Stockyards were very thriving in the 1800s and early 1900s. However, as people started to move west, they actually brought their cattle and animals with them, so there was less of a need to have a centralized slaughtering area, and there was more individually owned farms and locations that moved out west, and the Union Stockyards were closed in 1972. So with people being unemployed because the stockyards closed in 1970s, people had to figure out what to do, and Chicago had to redefine itself as of what kind of opportunities would allow for employment in the area. And as the stockyards closed, the stores came in, and it became a retail mecca, with major stores going to downtown Chicago area, stores named like Montgomery Ward, Sears would come to the area, and there'd be a large shopping presence. Let's talk about the people that had come here for working opportunities and still do so today. The first ones that came were the Irish Catholics, and they came into the Chicagoland area as a result of the Great Famine. After the Irish Catholics came the Germans, the English, Swedes, and Dutch. The population of the city grew very rapidly, and in 1840, Chicago was the 92nd most populous city in the United States, and that grew very quickly. Within 20 years, the city grew from 4,000 until 90,000, and the city grew from 299,000 to 1.7 million by the early 1900s. But individuals came from all over Europe to have jobs, to look for a better life. The next wave of immigrants came from southern Europe, Poles, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Hungarian, Czechs, and so on. They came throughout Eastern Europe, from Russia as well. The immigrants from Europe continued until World War I, and when World War I began, then immigration was cut off from Europe. There were jobs to be had with the Chicagoland Transportation District and also the meatpacking companies, and so with immigration cut off from Europe, individuals from the South began to move into the Chicagoland area in what was called the Great Migration. The population of Chicago grew so rapidly that some individuals felt that they would move out to the suburbs to have less of a concentration of people and maybe better opportunity. And so two of the suburbs that were first formed were Oak Park and Evanston. Wealthier families moved out of the city and into the suburbs in order to get a better education. So there's always been a debate over private versus public schools in the Chicagoland area, and some viewed that the Chicago public school system was inferior and then moved out into the suburbs and started their own schools. More and more people moved out of the city and they moved into the Chicagoland suburbs. The trend accelerated in 1945, and new highways and train lines were made to make commuting easier so they could work in the Chicago city but then live in the suburbs. Presently, there's also immigration continuing into the Chicagoland area, and more recently, the newer ethnic groups to come were Asians, Mexican, and Puerto Ricans. The immigrants all brought their food with them, and this continues to the day. You might find pockets in the city that are delegated to specific ethnic cultures, and there's restaurants with their food, grocery stores with their food within those areas. So the immigrants brought their food with them. In our Chicago history, there's a heavy presence of German and Irish. Those were the first to come. And then the locals also brought and set up store because they wanted their foods to be with them in their neighborhoods where they settled. You can watch a few videos about food on the resources link, but foods that were famous from Chicago are listed here. I think most people could identify Chicago with a deep dish pizza, perhaps even hot dogs and potato chips, but we're probably not as familiar with the fact that the Italian beef, the brownie, and actually the cafeteria was all started in Chicagoland area. There's a quick video about pizza that you can watch from the resources link, the history of pizza. As well, there's a video about the history of Vienna beef and the hot dogs, which are famous in the Chicagoland area. Very close to Triton College, and one of the more famous restaurants is Tom's Steakhouse on North Avenue, and that was listed as one of the most famous restaurants in Illinois. So in summary, there was a large presence of Native Americans that were inhabiting Chicago by the Chicago River. They grew their native foods like onions. They also planted the Three Sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash. The settlers came from Europe, and they settled in the Chicago area. The major presence of jobs within the Chicago area at that time was the transportation hub by boats, by the Illinois Canal, and then by the trains and the refrigerated trains. And when that transportation hub grew, we were able to ship the lumber from Wisconsin, the corn and wheat from Illinois to various locations throughout the United States. And then the stock markets developed, and animals were raised in Chicago or shipped to Chicago to be slaughtered and then sent throughout the United States. So the jobs were there and people came. The Europeans came prior to World War I, but when that war broke out, the immigration from Europe pretty much halted, and that's when we saw the Great Migration from the South, where the African Americans came northward looking for better jobs. All of these individuals brought the food with them, and immigration still continues to this day with individuals coming in from Asia, Puerto Rico, Mexico. We have immigrants from all over the world coming to Chicago, and you can see the diversity in the different neighborhoods and the mix of them in the Chicagoland area. A lot of foods are famous from Chicago, and some of them were listed on these presentations. And lastly, I need you to take the time to watch this video called The Foods of Chicago from WTTW. It's a couple-hour video, but it's very educational in terms of it shows various ethnic cultures, the different foods they brought with them into the Chicago area, so we can learn about a lot of different cultures by watching this movie about who settled in Chicago.